There was a word the ancient Greeks used for what happens when you finally stop clenching your jaw, your shoulders, the part of your chest that tightens without you noticing. Anases, a release. 23 centuries ago, a philosopher built an entire school around the idea that this feeling, this quiet unclenching, was the highest thing a human life could aim for. His name was Epicurus, and the world would spend the next 2,000 years getting him almost completely wrong. Tonight, the four-part cure he left behind. 4 sentences that fit on a coin, designed to dissolve the 4 things that keep you awake at night. In the year 270 BCE, a man dying of kidney stones dictated a letter to his closest friend, and the first thing he said was that he was happy. His name was Epicurus. He was 71 years old, and his body was failing in every way a body can fail. The medical term for what was killing him is strangury, a condition where you can barely pass urine drop by agonizing drop. He also had dysentery. So we're talking about a man in extraordinary physical distress, not the quiet, dignified kind of dying that happens in stories, the ugly kind, the kind that strips away every pretense. And in the middle of all of that, he picked up, or more likely, dictated to someone beside him, a letter to a man named Idomeneus. And here's what he said. On this blissful day, which is also the last of my life, I write this to you. My continual sufferings from strangury and dysentery are so great that nothing could augment them. But over against them, all I set gladness of mind at the remembrance of our past conversations. That's not someone performing calm for an audience. That's not a philosopher putting on a brave face for posterity. There's too much specific medical detail for that. He's nomming exactly how badly he's suffering, not minimizing it. He's saying the pain is real, it is total, and it doesn't matter, because there's something on the other side of the scale that outweighs it, and what he puts on that other side is interesting. Not his achievements, not his legacy, not even his ideas. Just the memory of talking with his friends. That's a strange thing to be enough, not scripture, not prayer, not some vision of what awaits on the other side. Conversations, the memory of sitting with people he loved and talking about things that mattered. And it raises a question that's hard to shake once you've heard it. What did this man know? What had he figured out about being alive and about dying that let him arrive at the end like that, not serene in spite of the pain, but somehow alongside it, calling the worst day of his life blissful and apparently meaning it? Most people, if they've heard of Epicurus at all, associate him with pleasure, with indulgence, with the idea that the point of life is to enjoy yourself as much as possible. That's the popular version. The word Epicurean in English basically means someone who likes expensive food and fine wine. But the man himself lived on bread and water, and he died calling a day of agony blissful. So something about the popular version is very, very wrong. The answer has to do with a very unusual idea of what philosophy is for. Because Epicurus didn't think of philosophy the way most of us do, as an intellectual exercise, a set of arguments you evaluate for logical consistency, maybe something you study in school and forget. He thought of it as medicine. Literally, he wrote, we must concern ourselves with the healing of our own lives, not the understanding of the world, not the pursuit of truth for its own sake, the healing. Like something was broken, and philosophy was the thing that could fix it. There's a Greek word he used for what this healing produces, anases. It means something like relaxation or release or, and this is the closest English gets, an unclenching. If you've ever been lying in bed at night and noticed that your jaw is tight, your shoulders are up around your ears, and you didn't realize you were holding all of that tension until you suddenly let go, that moment of letting go is close to what Epicurus meant. Anases. The opposite of the grip that anxiety has on your body when you don't even know it's there. He built an entire school of philosophy around producing that feeling, not just in comfortable moments, but in the worst ones, even, as it turns out, on the day you die. And the way he went about it is unlike anything else in the history of Western thought. And the tool he built for it has a name that sounds like it belongs in a pharmacy, not a philosophy lecture. The Tetrapharmakos, the 4-part cure, and it was originally a pharmacy term. The word Tetrapharmakos was already in use in the ancient world. It referred to an actual medical compound made of 4 ingredients: wax, tallow, pitch, and resin. You'd melt them together and use the mixture to treat wounds and skin conditions. It was practical, physical, and ordinary. Roman-era Epicureans took that word and borrowed it for something else. 4 remedies, they said, but for the soul instead of the skin. 4 statements that, if you could really internalize them, not just understand them but feel them in your bones, would cure you of the 4 things that make human life miserable. Don't fear God, don't worry about death. What is good is easy to get. What is terrible is easy to endure. That's it, 4 lines, they fit on a coin. Followers of Epicurus actually did put them on coins and on tablets and on walls. We'll get to one particular wall later and the dying man who built it. The point is, these 4 sentences were treated not as suggestions or proverbs but as medicine, a prescription you could carry with you. And each one of them, when you start to unpack it, goes much deeper than it sounds. Don't fear God isn't atheism, it's something stranger. Don't worry about death isn't bravery, it's a logical argument so clean it's almost unsettling. What is good is easy to get isn't optimism, it's a radical redefinition of what good means. And what is terrible is easy to endure isn't toughness, it's the claim that the worst thing you can imagine is actually more survivable than you think. Each of those cures, it turns out, unfolds into something much bigger than a single sentence. And the man behind them, the man on that deathbed, didn't arrive at these ideas from a place of comfort or leisure. He came to philosophy the hard way, as a refugee with nothing, on an island that had just thrown his family out. Epicurus was born in February 341 BCE on the island of Samos, a green, rocky place in the eastern Aegean, close enough to the coast of modern Turkey that you can almost see it from shore. His parents were Athenian colonists, which meant he grew up Greek but not quite Athenian, not quite home and not quite elsewhere. That distinction wouldn't matter much until Alexander the Great died, and then it mattered enormously. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, the political order he'd held together started coming apart. And one of the things that came apart was the arrangement that had kept Athenian settlers on Samos. The island's original inhabitants wanted their land back, and they got it. The Athenians were expelled, Epicurus's family among them, and they ended up in Colophon, a city on the coast of what's now Turkey. Just like that, Epicurus was a refugee. 18 years old, give or take, with no home to return to and no clear future. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. Before Epicurus was a philosopher, before he founded a school or wrote a single word about the nature of the universe, he was someone who'd had his world pulled out from under him. Displacement doesn't just change where you live, it changes what you think you can count on. And maybe this is speculation, but it feels right. It makes you especially interested in figuring out what remains stable when everything external falls away. We don't know much about those in-between years. Epicurus wandered. He studied, probably under followers of Democritus, the atomist, whose ideas about the fundamental nature of matter would become the backbone of everything Epicurus later taught. He taught small groups, he gathered people. And slowly, the outlines of a philosophy began to take shape, not in a library or a lecture hall, but in the life of someone who'd already learned the hard way that the things most people build their security on can vanish overnight. It took him decades, but eventually Epicurus made his way to Athens, and in 306 BCE, he did something that might have looked modest from the outside, but was actually one of the most quietly radical acts in the history of Western thought. He bought a house with a garden. The location matters. His property sat roughly halfway between the Stoa Poikal, the painted colonnade where Zeno would soon begin teaching what became Stoicism, and the grounds of Plato's Academy, which was still operating under Plato's intellectual heirs. Epicurus literally positioned himself between the two most powerful philosophical institutions in Athens. Whether that was intentional or just a coincidence of real estate, the symbolism is hard to miss. He was planting himself in the middle and saying, neither of those, something else. The school that grew around that property became known simply as the garden. Ho-kipos in Greek, not the academy, not the lyceum, a garden. There's something telling about that. This wasn't a grand institution with columned halls and inscribed mottos. It was a house with a yard where people gathered to eat, talk, and figure out how to be less afraid. And what made it different from every other philosophical school in Athens wasn't just the ideas discussed there, it was who was allowed in. Think about what philosophy looked like in Athens at this time. It was largely the domain of wealthy, free-born Greek men. Plato's academy had a reputation for exclusivity. Tradition holds that the words, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter," were inscribed above its door, which tells you something about the entrance requirements. Aristotle's Lyceum was no better. Aristotle himself had argued in writing that some people were natural slaves, incapable of the kind of deliberative reasoning that philosophy requires. These were elite institutions for elite minds, and they were not shy about saying so. Against that background, the garden was startling. Women were welcome, slaves were welcome, foreigners were welcome. If you wanted to think seriously about how to live, you could come in and sit down. No geometry required, no pedigree checked. The price of admission was curiosity and nothing more. The daily life inside the garden was as unusual as its membership policy. Most philosophical schools charged tuition, sometimes substantial amounts. The garden didn't. Instead, the community lived together in a kind of voluntary frugality. Their shared meals were simple to the point of austerity. Bread, water, that was standard. And when Epicurus wanted to celebrate, when he wanted to mark an occasion as genuinely special, he would ask a friend to send him a small pot of cheese. A pot of cheese, that was a luxury. For the man whose name would become synonymous, centuries later, with gourmet excess and refined pleasure, the word Epicurean in English basically means someone with expensive taste. A pot of cheese was an indulgence. The gap between the reputation and the reality is almost comical, but it also tells you something important about what Epicurus actually believed. He thought the good life was available to anyone, not because he thought everyone should have more, but because he thought almost no one needed as much as they thought they did. That idea that most of what people chase is unnecessary, and that genuine contentment is simpler than we imagine, wasn't just a theory discussed in the garden. It was the daily texture of life there. The philosophy wasn't something you heard in a lecture and then went home to your normal existence. You lived inside it. You ate its conclusions for dinner. You practiced its logic with every meal you didn't need to make elaborate, every status marker you didn't need to pursue, every comfort you discovered you could do without and not miss. And you shared all of that with people who, in every other institution in Athens, would never have been allowed to sit beside you. And some of those people made the philosophy better. A slave named Mouse and a woman named Leontian would both prove, in their own ways, that thinking isn't the exclusive property of the privileged. One of the people who walked through the garden's gate was a man named Mies. That's a Greek word. It means mouse. We don't know his birth name. Mies may have been what his owner called him, or what everyone called him, or a name he chose for himself. What we know is that he was a slave, and that in the garden he studied philosophy alongside free citizens as an equal. Try to feel how strange that would have been in Athens in the early 3rd century BCE. This was a city where the entire economy ran on slave labor, where the distinction between free and unfree was built into every institution, every legal code, every philosophical argument about what it meant to be human. Aristotle, the most influential thinker of the preceding generation, the man who had tutored Alexander the Great, had argued explicitly that some people are slaves by nature. That they lack the deliberative faculty, the capacity for rational self-governance. That slavery isn't just a social arrangement, but a reflection of a natural hierarchy. And here's Epicurus just a few years later in a garden down the road from where Aristotle's students still gather, saying, "Sit down, Mouse. Tell me what you think. What are you afraid of? What keeps you up at night?" There's no record of what Mies contributed to the philosophical discussions. No surviving writings, no famous arguments. He's a footnote in a handful of ancient sources. History remembers the philosophers who wrote books, not the ones who just showed up and listened and thought, but his presence mattered enormously. Because a philosophy that claims the good life is available to everyone, that the cure for anxiety isn't wealth or status or divine favor, but simply understanding how the universe works, that philosophy can't be credible if it only admits wealthy freeborn men through the door. The garden practiced what it preached, and Mouse is the proof. He wasn't the only one. There was also a woman named Leontian, and she didn't just participate in the garden's discussions, she fought back against the philosophical establishment. Leontian wrote an entire treatise criticizing the work of Theophrastus, who was Aristotle's direct successor as head of the Lyceum. Think about what that means. A woman in a world where women had almost no public intellectual role took on the most prestigious philosopher in Athens, in writing, by name. We don't have her treatise anymore. Like almost everything connected to the garden, it's lost, and we'll come to just how much was lost later and what that destruction cost us. But we know Leontian's work existed because of the reactions it provoked. Plutarch, writing centuries later, expressed outrage that a woman had dared to criticize such a distinguished philosopher. Not that her arguments were wrong, not that her reasoning was weak, that she was a woman. The quality of her work wasn't the issue, her identity was. And the fact that Plutarch was still angry about it hundreds of years later tells you something about how threatening the garden's inclusivity was to the philosophical establishment. So far, what we've seen of Epicurus might look like a social experiment, a commune, a radical community built on equality and simple living where a slave named Mouse studies beside free citizens and a woman named Leontian takes on the most powerful philosopher in the city. And it was all of those things, beautiful, improbable, quietly defiant things. But underneath all of it, underneath the shared meals, the open door, the bread and water, Mouse and Leontian, there was a foundation that might surprise you. Because Epicurus's entire philosophical system doesn't rest on ethics or politics or social theory. It rests on physics, hard materialist physics. The kind that starts with the smallest possible thing and builds a whole universe out of it. Epicurus was at bottom a materialist, a thoroughgoing one. He believed that everything in the universe, every object, every sensation, every thought, every emotion, every moment of consciousness is made of atoms moving through empty space. Void and atoms, that's all there is. There is no supernatural realm, no immaterial soul, no divine substance woven into the fabric of reality. Just tiny indivisible particles in various arrangements, colliding, combining, falling apart, recombining. That's a startling claim to make in a world where most people believe the gods shaped every thunderstorm, every plague, every harvest. Epicurus looked at all of that and said, atoms, just atoms doing what atoms do. And this includes you, all of you. Your body is atoms, your mind is atoms. That feeling you get when you're lying in bed and can't quite articulate what's wrong but something is definitely off, that's atoms too. Your soul, and Epicurus did use that word. He didn't deny that humans have something you could call a soul. Your soul is made of especially fine, smooth atoms distributed throughout your body. They're what let you feel and think and perceive. And when your body dies, those atoms don't go anywhere special. They scatter, they drift apart, they rejoin the general traffic of matter in the universe, and that's it. There's no you anymore, not a diminished you, not a ghostly you, not a judged and sentenced you. No you, the dissolution is complete, and because it's complete, it's also painless. You can't suffer the absence of yourself because there's no one left to do the suffering, not darkness, not an empty room, not floating in nothing, just nothing. The kind of nothing that can't even be experienced as nothing. That idea that death is total dissolution is going to turn out to be the foundation of everything Epicurus has to say about fear. But before we get to the arguments, there's one more piece of the physics we need. Because Epicurus inherited atoms from a philosopher named Democritus, and he kept almost everything Democritus taught. Almost. He made one change, and that change is, in some ways, the most important idea in his entire system. Democritus, who lived about a century before Epicurus, had already figured out the atoms part. He's the one who first proposed that if you keep dividing matter, break a stone in half, then in half again, then again and again, you'll eventually reach something that can't be divided any further. Atomos, uncuttable. And from those uncuttable particles, built up in different arrangements, everything in the universe is made. It's an astonishing leap of intuition for someone working more than 2,000 years ago, without microscopes, without chemistry, without any of the tools we'd later use to confirm that he was, in the most basic sense, right. Epicurus took this idea and ran with it. But Democritus had a problem. In his version of atomism, atoms fall through the void in straight lines, governed by strict mechanical necessity. Every movement is determined by what came before it. Every collision is the inevitable result of prior collisions, stretching back to the beginning of everything. And if that's true, if the universe is just atoms falling in straight lines, bouncing off each other according to fixed laws, then there's no room for choice, no room for you to decide anything. Your thoughts, your feelings, your sense of making a decision, all of it is just atoms doing what atoms were always going to do. Democritus's universe is a beautiful machine, but it's a machine, and machines don't choose. Epicurus saw this problem, and his solution was startlingly small. He proposed that atoms, as they fall through the void, occasionally swerve, not by much, not predictably, not because of any external force, they just deviate, a tiny random departure from the straight line. The Greek term that's come down to us actually through the Latin poet Lucretius, who we'll meet later, is klinemen, the swerve. It sounds minor, almost trivial, but it changes everything. Because if atoms can swerve, if the fundamental constituents of reality have this element of unpredictability built in, then the chain of mechanical causation isn't unbreakable. There's a crack in the determinism. And through that crack, Epicurus argued, comes something that matters enormously, the possibility of free will, not free will as something supernatural or magical. Free will as an emergent property of matter that isn't completely locked into predetermined paths. Your capacity to choose in this framework isn't an illusion that sits on top of a deterministic machine. It's built into the machine itself at the deepest level. The atoms swerve, and because they swerve, you can choose. It's a strange thing to build an entire philosophy of freedom on, a wobble, an infinitesimal deviation, but there's something honest about it. Epicurus didn't claim human freedom is grand or transcendent or handed down by the gods. He said it comes from the same place everything else comes from, atoms behaving in ways that aren't entirely predictable. Freedom in this view is ordinary, it's physics. And that makes it in a way more trustworthy than if it were a gift from above, because gifts can be taken back, but atoms don't stop swerving. Now, we talked earlier about what happens to your soul atoms when you die. They scatter, disperse, and there's no you left to experience anything. But it's worth pausing on that a little longer, because the implications are more radical than they might first appear. When Epicurus says the soul is made of atoms, he means it literally, not metaphorically, not as a poetic image. Your awareness, your capacity to feel pain or pleasure, your sense of being a person, all of that is the activity of fine, smooth atoms arranged in a specific pattern throughout your body. And the key word is arranged. The soul doesn't exist independently. It exists because of its arrangement. Like how a word exists because of the arrangement of letters, scatter the letters, and the word isn't hiding somewhere diminished but still present. It's gone. The concept disappears when the structure does. So death for Epicurus isn't a transition. It's not a door to another room. There's no room on the other side. When the body that holds your soul atoms together ceases to function, those atoms drift apart and the pattern that was you unravels completely. There's no darkness to float in, no void to be aware of, no loneliness to endure. The dissolution is total, and because it's total, there's nothing to fear in it. You can't have a bad experience of something you can't experience at all. But here's where Epicurus takes a turn that surprises a lot of people. Because given all this atoms, void, determinism with a swerve, souls that scatter at death, you might expect Epicurus to be an atheist. And he wasn't, not exactly. He didn't deny that gods exist. What he did was redefine them so thoroughly that they became, for all practical purposes, irrelevant. His first principle doctrine, the very first of 40 statements that his followers treated as foundational, puts it like this: that which is blessed and immortal is not troubled itself, nor does it cause trouble to any other. The gods exist. They're real, they're beautiful, they're blessed, and they have absolutely nothing to do with you. They don't watch, they don't judge, they don't punish, they don't reward. They exist in a state of perfect tranquility, perfectly indifferent to human affairs. Anger, Epicurus said, and gratitude, those are emotions that belong only to the weak, and the gods are not weak. It's a remarkable theological move. He doesn't pick a fight with religion. He doesn't argue that the gods are fake. He simply removes their teeth. And with the teeth gone, the fear that comes from imagining a powerful being that might be watching, might be angry, might be planning your punishment, that fear has no object. The gods are beautiful things to contemplate, not dangerous things to appease. And that leads us very naturally to the first of the 4 cures, the one that says, don't fear God. Because there's nothing to be afraid of. The first of the 4 cures is the simplest to state and the most radical in its implications. Don't fear God, 3 words, and behind them, an entire rethinking of what divinity means. Epicurus laid this out in the very first of his 40 principal doctrines, a collection of concise statements that his followers memorized, discussed, and treated as foundational truths. The first doctrine reads, a blessed, immortal being has no troubles and creates none for others, because anger and gratitude exist only in the weak. Sit with that phrase for a moment. Anger and gratitude exist only in the weak. That's an extraordinary claim. In the ancient world, and honestly in much of the modern one too, the default assumption about gods is that they're powerful beings who care intensely about what humans do. They reward the faithful, they punish the wicked, they watch, they keep track. The entire machinery of religious anxiety runs on this assumption. Somewhere above you, something powerful is paying attention, and you'd better hope it approves. Epicurus says no, a truly powerful being, a truly blessed being wouldn't bother with any of that. Anger requires being disturbed by something. Gratitude requires needing something from someone. Both are responses to insufficiency. You get angry when something threatens you. You feel grateful when someone gives you what you lacked. A God who is truly complete, truly blessed, would have no insufficiency. Nothing could threaten it. Nothing could supply what it was missing. So it would have no reason to be angry and no reason to be grateful. It would just be perfectly calm, perfectly content, perfectly unconcerned with the dramas playing out on the surface of a small planet. This isn't atheism, and that's an important distinction because a lot of people assume Epicurus was an ancient atheist and leave it there. He wasn't. He was very clear about that. He didn't say the gods don't exist. He said they do exist, they're real beings, genuinely beautiful, genuinely immortal, but they're not what you think they are. They're not what the temples and the priests and the sacrificial rituals suggest. His approach was something subtler than denial, something you might call theological disarmament. He defanged divinity. He took the gods and carefully, systematically removed everything about them that could hurt you. In Epicurean cosmology, the gods live in places called the metacosmia, the spaces between worlds. The universe for Epicurus isn't one cosmos but many, an infinite number of worlds formed by atoms colliding in infinite void. And in the gaps between these worlds, in regions of perfect calm and stability, the gods reside. They're beautiful, they're blessed, they live in a state of permanent, undisturbed happiness, and they have nothing to do with you. No wrath, no favor, no surveillance. No plan for your life, no interest in your prayers. They exist in the same universe you do, but they might as well be in a different dimension. You can admire them. Epicurus thought contemplating the gods' perfect tranquility was actually a useful exercise, a kind of model for the serenity you yourself could aspire to. But you don't need to fear them. There's nothing to fear. Think about what that does to you practically. If you've ever lain awake at night wondering whether you've made the right choices, whether some cosmic authority is keeping score, whether the suffering in your life might be punishment for something you did or failed to do, Epicurus says, stop. That voice isn't divine, it's just anxiety wearing a mask. The gods are real, but they don't care, not because they're cruel, but because caring would diminish them. Their indifference is a sign of their perfection, not their absence. There's something almost meditative about that image if you let it settle. The gods, perfectly happy in their perfect silence, somewhere far away. You here breathing, neither of you needing the other. For a lot of people in the ancient world, this was enormously liberating. The constant background hum of religious anxiety. Am I offending the gods? Have I performed the rituals correctly? Is this illness a punishment? That hum goes quiet when you internalize the first cure. The gods are there in their beautiful silence between worlds, and you are here, and neither of you needs anything from the other. But Epicurus didn't stop at gods. Removing the fear of divine punishment was just the first step, the outer wall of the fortress he was trying to dismantle. The second cure goes after something deeper, something that for most people, whether they admit it or not, is the deepest fear there is. Death, Epicurus wrote, the most awful of evils is nothing to us, seeing that when we are, death is not come, and when death is come, we are not. That sentence has been quoted for over 2,000 years. It's been translated into every language philosophy reaches. It's been called the most elegant argument in the entire history of philosophy, and its logic is devastatingly simple. You and death can never coexist. When you're alive, death hasn't arrived. When death arrives, you're gone. There's no moment where you and death are in the same room together. You never have to experience it. The thing you're afraid of being dead is something you will never actually go through, because going through things requires being there, and death is precisely the condition of not being there. It sounds almost too easy, and if you feel like there must be a catch somewhere, you're not alone. Philosophers have been trying to find the flaw in this argument for 2 millennia. Some have succeeded, or at least they think they have, but the argument keeps coming back because there's something deeply right about its core observation. The fear of death is a fear of an experience you cannot have, and if that's true, then the fear is not about death at all. It's about something else. Something that happens only while you're alive, which is exactly where the next part of Epicurus's case begins. The argument that death is nothing to us, that you and death can never share a room, is powerful. But Epicurus knew it wasn't enough on its own, because the fear of death isn't really about the moment of dying, is it? Most people, if they're honest, aren't afraid of the instant itself. They're afraid of the long stretch of knowing it's coming, the anticipation, the shadow it casts over ordinary life. The way it can take a perfectly calm evening and fill it with dread just because your mind happened to wander in the wrong direction. Epicurus addressed this directly. In his letter to Menocius, one of only 3 letters of his that survive intact, he wrote what might be the most economical refutation of death anxiety anyone has ever produced. Foolish, therefore, is the person who says that he fears death, not because it will pain when it comes, but because it pains in the prospect. Whatever causes no annoyance when it is present, causes only a groundless pain in the expectation. Read that again slowly, because the logic is very precise. Death, when it arrives, causes no pain. You won't be there to feel it. So if you're suffering now because of death, your suffering isn't coming from death itself. It's coming from your expectation of death. And if the thing you're expecting is itself painless, then the pain you feel while expecting it is groundless. It's real pain. Epicurus isn't dismissing what you feel, but it's pain without an object. You're hurting yourself by anticipating something that cannot hurt you. It's like being afraid of the color blue. You can feel genuine fear. The sweat is real. The tight chest is real. But the thing you're afraid of isn't dangerous. And once you see that, really see it, not just understand it intellectually, but absorb it, the fear doesn't necessarily vanish, but it loosens its grip. It becomes something you can look at rather than something that looks at you. About 2 centuries after Epicurus, a Roman poet named Lucretius took this argument and extended it in a direction that's hard to argue with. Lucretius said, think about the eternity before you were born. All those billions of years when you didn't exist, the formation of the earth, the rise and fall of species, the entire history of the universe before you showed up. Were you suffering during any of that? Were you floating in darkness, miserable, wishing you could be born? No, of course not. You weren't there to wish for anything. That void was nothing to you. Now look forward. After you die, there will be another eternity. And Lucretius's point is devastatingly simple. It's the same void, facing the other direction. The time after your death is the mirror image of the time before your birth. If you don't mourn your prenatal non-existence, if you don't lie awake grieving all the centuries you missed before you were born, then why mourn your posthumous non-existence? They're the same thing. They feel the same way, which is to say they don't feel any way at all. This is sometimes called the symmetry argument, and it's one of the hardest philosophical arguments to refute. People have tried. Some say there's an asymmetry. The future has a different emotional character than the past because the future could have contained more of your life and the past couldn't. Others say the argument proves too much. If death is nothing, then so is the deprivation of future experiences, and surely that matters. These are real objections. But the core of Lucretius's point remains. If you can make peace with the eternity before you, you can make peace with the eternity after. And there's something about hearing this argument late at night when the house is quiet and your mind starts doing that thing where it tries to comprehend the end of your own consciousness, something about the symmetry argument that works not just logically but almost physically. It rearranges something. You were nothing and it was fine. You will be nothing, and if you can feel the symmetry, it'll be fine again. Not because someone promised you a reward, not because a god is watching over you. Just because the nothing before wasn't bad, and the nothing after has no reason to be different. Epicurus's final word on the matter comes from the same letter to Menocius. The wise person, he wrote, does not deprecate life, nor does he fear the cessation of life. The thought of life is no offense to him, nor is the cessation of life regarded as an evil. That's a very specific kind of balance. The wise person doesn't hate being alive, they enjoy it fully with gratitude, but they also don't cling. They don't treat life as something that must be preserved at all costs, or death as something that must be fought off at all costs. They exist in a middle state where life is good and its ending isn't an enemy, not because they're brave, not because they're numb, but because they've understood all the way down that death isn't a thing that happens to you. It's a thing that ends you, and the ending itself is nothing. There's a peacefulness to that idea that I think Epicurus intended. He wasn't writing philosophy for the lecture hall. He was writing medicine for the insomniac mind. And the second cure, don't worry about death, works best if you let it sink in slowly, the way water soaks into dry soil. Not all at once, not as a sudden revelation, just a gradual softening of the grip that the idea of your own ending has on you. But Epicurus's remedy wasn't only about removing fears. The first two cures take things away, the fear of gods, the fear of death. The third and fourth cures work differently. They address something more intimate and more everyday, what you want and how much of what you want is actually necessary. Here's what most people think Epicureanism is about: pleasure. Enjoy yourself. Eat well, drink well, surround yourself with beautiful things, and maximize the amount of good feeling in your life. And since most people also think of Epicurus as a hedonist, the word Epicurean is literally a synonym for someone with refined and expensive taste. It would make sense for his third and fourth cures to be about seeking more pleasure and satisfying more desires. They're about the exact opposite. The highest pleasure in Epicurean philosophy isn't indulgence. It isn't the thrill of getting something you wanted, or the rush of a meal after you've been hungry, or the satisfaction of any desire at all. The highest pleasure is the absence of disturbance. That's it. Epicurus had two Greek words for it: ataraxia, which means freedom from mental anxiety, and aponia, which means freedom from bodily pain. Put them together and you get the Epicurean ideal, a state where nothing hurts and nothing worries you. Not ecstasy, not bliss, just calm. The ceiling of pleasure for Epicurus is simply not hurting. That's one of the most radical claims in the history of philosophy, and it takes a moment to fully absorb. Let it sit for a second. We're used to thinking of pleasure as something you add to your life, something you pursue, chase, accumulate. Epicurus is saying that pleasure isn't something you add. It's what's already there when you subtract the things that disturb you. The baseline state of a human being, if you could strip away all the anxiety and all the pain, is already good. You don't need to add anything. You just need to stop taking things away from yourself. To make this more precise, Epicurus distinguished between two types of pleasure. He called them kinetic pleasure and cadasmatic pleasure. Kinetic pleasure is the active process of satisfying a desire, the eating, the drinking, the relief of an itch scratched. It's movement toward satisfaction. And it feels good. Epicurus doesn't deny that, but it's temporary by nature because once the desire is satisfied, the pleasure stops. You eat until you're full, and then eating isn't pleasurable anymore. The pleasure existed only in the gap between wanting and having. Cadasmatic pleasure is different. It's the stable state of having no unmet needs, not the moment of scratching the itch, but the longer period of not having an itch at all. It's static rather than dynamic, sustained rather than fleeting. And Epicurus argued that this, the quiet absence of want, is the higher form of pleasure, the one worth pursuing because you can sustain it. You can build a life around it. You can't build a life around kinetic pleasure because kinetic pleasure requires you to be perpetually in a state of need that's perpetually being satisfied, which is exhausting and ultimately impossible. If that sounds familiar, it might be because you've encountered the idea from a different direction. Anyone who's ever wanted something badly, gotten it, and then found that the getting didn't feel as good as the wanting. Anyone who's noticed that the thrill fades and the wanting starts up again, pointed at a new object, has stumbled onto exactly what Epicurus is describing. Kinetic pleasure is a treadmill. Cadasmatic pleasure is stepping off. And this is where the fourth cure comes in, because to achieve cadasmatic pleasure, to actually live in a state where your needs are met and you're not scrambling for more, you need to understand which of your desires actually matter. Epicurus had a system for this. He divided all human desires into three categories. The first category, natural and necessary, food when you're hungry, water when you're thirsty, shelter from the cold, friendship. These are the needs that nature built into you, and they're straightforward to satisfy. A loaf of bread, a cup of water, a warm room, and someone to talk to. That's the list. It's short. The second category, natural but unnecessary. Luxury food when plain food would do. Fine clothing when simple clothing would keep you warm. A bigger house. A more varied diet. These desires are rooted in real needs. You do need food, you do need clothing, but they've been inflated beyond what the need actually requires. They're the excess. And satisfying them brings kinetic pleasure, sure, but it doesn't bring you any closer to the stable calm of cadasmatic pleasure. You've added complexity to your life without adding peace. The third category, vain and empty. Fame, power, immortality, the desire to be remembered, the desire to be admired. The desire to accumulate more than you need so that you feel secure against losses that may never come. These are traps. They multiply anxiety rather than reducing it because they can never be fully satisfied. There's always someone more famous, more powerful, more secure. The goalpost moves, and every step toward it feels urgent but produces nothing lasting. Epicurus said, satisfy the first category. That's easy. Enjoy the second category if it comes your way, but don't chase it. And the third category, recognize it for what it is and let it go. Because every vain desire you carry is a weight on your mind that makes ataraxia harder to reach. Every empty want is another thing between you and the state of not hurting that is, for Epicurus, the best a human life can be. Remember the garden, bread, water, and a pot of cheese as luxury. That wasn't austerity for its own sake. That was the third and fourth cures in practice. A community of people who'd sorted their desires, kept the necessary ones, released the empty ones, and found that what remained was enough. More than enough, it was peaceful. And Epicurus believed that if you could fully internalize all four cures, truly absorb them, not just understand them but feel them reshape the way you move through the world, release the fear of gods, release the fear of death, understand that real pleasure is the absence of pain, and let go of desires that can't be satisfied, something extraordinary would happen. Something he claimed could make a mortal feel immortal. Epicurus made a promise that sounds almost absurd, given everything we've just discussed. a materialist who believed the soul is made of atoms, that gods don't care about you, that death is total annihilation, and that the best pleasure is just the absence of pain. This man promised that his philosophy could make you feel like a god. Man loses all semblance of mortality, he wrote, by living in the midst of immortal blessings. That's a staggering claim, and it deserves to be taken seriously because Epicurus wasn't given to exaggeration. He lived on bread and water. He wasn't the kind of thinker who inflated his conclusions. So when he says you can lose the semblance of mortality, that you can experience what immortality feels like, he means something specific. Here's what he means. The gods, remember, live in perfect tranquility. They have no unmet desires, no fears, no anxieties. They exist in a permanent state of ataraxia, the undisturbed calm that is, for Epicurus, the highest possible condition. Now a human being who has fully internalized the four cures, who genuinely doesn't fear the gods, genuinely doesn't fear death, genuinely understands that pleasure is the absence of disturbance, and has released all empty desires, that person has achieved the same state. Not permanently, not literally. A mortal can't actually become immortal. But in the moments when the four cures are fully active, when you're sitting in the garden with friends, eating simple food, free from the anxieties that grip most people, you're experiencing what the gods experience. The quality of the feeling is the same, only the duration is different. There's something almost tender about that idea. Epicurus isn't promising heaven. He's not offering an afterlife as a reward for good behavior. He's saying the best state a conscious being can experience is available to you right now in this life with the resources you already have. You don't need to die to get there. You don't need to be special. You just need to stop being afraid of the wrong things and stop wanting the wrong things. The cures are available. The garden is real. The bread is on the table, and the door is open to anyone willing to walk through it, just as it was in Athens for Mouse, for Laotian, for anyone who showed up with curiosity. Here's where it helps to step back and see the whole system from a height, because what Epicurus built is something we didn't really have a name for until modern times. Philosophers now call it philosophical therapy or philosophy as medicine. The Tetrapharmakos isn't just a collection of nice ideas. It's a systematic treatment protocol. It has a diagnosis. There are four sources of human misery: fear of gods, fear of death, misunderstanding of pleasure, and pursuit of empty desires. And it has a corresponding treatment, 4 cures, 1 for each disease. Administer them together and the patient recovers, the patient being you, the doctor being philosophy itself. That framing philosophy as literally medicinal, as something you take to heal, is one of the earliest examples of the approach. Other schools had elements of it. The Stoics had their exercises and the skeptics had their suspension of judgment. But Epicurus was the most explicit about the medical metaphor. He didn't say philosophy helps you understand the world better or think more clearly or win arguments. He said philosophy heals you. That's a different kind of claim entirely. The word he used, remember, was anasis, that unclenching, that release. The relaxation of a body that's been holding tension it didn't even know it was holding. That's what the cure produces. Not knowledge, not wisdom in the abstract, relief. And here's something that might give you goosebumps, or at least make you stop and think. Because Epicurus was not the only person in the ancient world who arrived at this exact kind of structure. About 500 years before Epicurus was born, and several thousand miles to the east, in what is now Nepal and northern India, a man named Siddhartha Gautama sat under a tree and arrived at a strikingly similar framework. The Buddha's 4 noble truths: life is suffering, suffering has a cause, the cause can be ended, and there is a path to end it. 4 statements, a diagnostic framework: identify the disease, understand its origin, establish that it's curable, and prescribe the treatment. The structural parallel with the Tetrapharmakos is hard to miss. Both are 4-part frameworks, both diagnose suffering, both prescribe a cure. Both aim at a state of calm that comes from releasing what disturbs you. The Buddha called it nirvana, Epicurus called it ataraxia, but the basic shape is remarkably close. Think about that for a moment. These two men, separated by geography, by language, by culture, by centuries of divergent intellectual tradition, by everything except the basic fact of being human and being troubled by being human, arrived at nearly the same conclusion. Suffering has identifiable causes. Those causes can be addressed. The remedy is not acquisition but release, and the release can be taught. There's no evidence they knew of each other. No trade route of ideas connecting Samos to the Ganges. This seems to be a case of convergent evolution, two minds faced with the same problem, inventing the same kind of tool, and that convergence is itself a kind of evidence. If two independent traditions arrive at the same diagnosis, maybe the diagnosis is right. Maybe the human mind really does have these specific failure modes, fear, craving, clinging, and maybe the cure really is this particular shape. 4 truths, 4 remedies, 4 steps toward not hurting. But Epicurus knew something that makes his cure different from a solitary meditation practice. He believed the medicine couldn't work alone. There was one ingredient he considered more essential than any argument, any logic, any insight into the nature of atoms or gods or death, and it's probably not what you'd expect from a philosopher. If you had to guess what Epicurus considered the single most important ingredient for a happy life, you might say ataraxia, or freedom from the fear of death, or the simple pleasures of bread and water and a quiet evening. Those are all important in his system. But Epicurus himself was explicit about what mattered most, and his answer might catch you off guard. Of all the means which are procured by wisdom to ensure happiness throughout the whole of life, he wrote, by far the most important is the acquisition of friends. Not virtue, the Stoics would have said virtue, not contemplation. Aristotle would have said contemplation, not pleasure, even though Epicurus is supposedly the philosopher of pleasure. Friendship, that's the ingredient he placed above everything else. The most important thing wisdom can teach you, according to the man who built a 4-part cure for existential dread, is how to make and keep friends. That's worth pausing on because it changes the shape of the philosophy. Up to this point, the Tetrapharmakos might sound like an individual project, something you do inside your own head, a private recalibration of fears and desires, and it can be that. But Epicurus didn't think it worked best that way. The cure is designed to be taken in company. The garden wasn't a retreat center for individual meditation. It was a dinner table, a conversation. A community of people who were scared of the same things and helped each other be less scared. There's a saying attributed to Epicurus that captures this perfectly. Friendship goes dancing round the world, announcing to all of us to wake up to happiness. If you know Epicurus only through the caricature, the reclusive hedonist, the philosopher who said live unknown, that quote should feel disorienting. This isn't a man hiding from the world. This is someone who believed that the cure for suffering is fundamentally social, that happiness is contagious. That it literally dances from person to person, waking people up. The image is striking. Friendship as a kind of joyful alarm clock going around the planet, tapping people on the shoulder and saying, you could be happier, not alone, with each other. For a philosopher who supposedly advocated withdrawal from the world, that's an awfully public, awfully generous vision. It's not the gospel of the recluse. It's the announcement of a shared cure, available to anyone, carried from person to person like a gift, amplified by the giving. And there's something in this idea that connects back to the sleepy time quality of the philosophy. Friendship for Epicurus wasn't the loud, competitive, social climbing kind. It was the kind you practice at a quiet dinner table, the kind where presence matters more than performance, where showing up and being honest about your fears is more valuable than being brilliant or impressive or entertaining. That's a gentle form of friendship, and it's at the absolute center of Epicurean happiness. And Epicurus was thoughtful about how friendship works. He wasn't naive about it. He acknowledged that friendship typically begins in self-interest. We make friends because they benefit us. There's nothing cynical about that. It's just honest. You seek out people whose company makes your life better, and they seek you out for the same reason. That's the natural starting point. But Epicurus argued that real friendship, mature friendship, the kind that actually heals, doesn't stay there. Over time, something shifts. The friend stops being a means to your happiness and becomes part of it. The friend has become part of our own life, he wrote, a part of ourselves. That's a subtle and important distinction. A friend who is a means to happiness is someone you keep around because they're useful. A friend who is part of your happiness is someone whose well-being is your well-being. Their joy is your joy. Their suffering is your suffering. The boundary between self-interest and genuine care dissolves. Not because you willed yourself to be selfless, that would be a stoic move, not an Epicurean one, but because the friendship grew organically past the point where the distinction between their good and your good still matters. Think about the people you're closest to, the ones where you stopped keeping track of who did what for whom, where the accounting of mutual benefit just fell away at some point and was replaced by something simpler. You care about them because they're them. That, for Epicurus, is friendship in its highest form, and it's not a nice-to-have, it's the cornerstone of the entire edifice. Without friendship, the four cures are just ideas. With friendship, they're medicine. This is ultimately why the garden worked, not just because Epicurus had the right arguments, although he did, or at least he believed he did, and not just because he had the right lifestyle prescriptions. It worked because the arguments and the lifestyle were embedded in a community of real people who cared about each other. You didn't just learn that death was nothing to fear. You sat with someone who was also afraid and you talked about it, and gradually the fear became smaller because it was shared. You didn't just learn that pleasure is the absence of pain. You ate simple meals with people who'd given up chasing luxury, and you felt that simplicity was genuinely enough because everyone around you felt the same. The philosophy was the shared meals. The philosophy was the conversation. The philosophy was friendship itself, practiced daily as a discipline and a form of love. Not romantic love, not family obligation, but the chosen, sustained, deliberate love of people who decide to face their fears together rather than alone. And Epicurus practiced it more faithfully than anyone. To understand what he meant by friendship, not as a concept but as a lived reality, you need to know about one friendship in particular. One that lasted decades, survived illness and grief, and ended twice over. Once when the friend died, and once more, 7 years later, when Epicurus himself followed. His name was Metrodorus of Lampsacus, and he was Epicurus's closest friend. The historical record gives us one detail about their bond that says more than any philosophical argument could. Metrodorus never left Epicurus's side for more than 6 months in his entire life. Think about that, not in a year, in his entire life. From the time Metrodorus joined the garden, the longest he was ever apart from Epicurus was half a year. Through decades of teaching, of writing, of building a community, of navigating the political and intellectual tensions of Athens, Metrodorus was there, not as a student, though he certainly studied, not as a disciple, though he certainly learned, as a friend. The kind of friend whose presence becomes so woven into your daily life that their absence feels like a missing limb. We don't know all the details of their friendship. History preserves the names and a few fragments, not the daily texture, but we can infer from what survives. They ate together at that simple table, bread, water, the occasional pot of cheese. They talked philosophy into the evenings. They worked through the implications of atomic theory, of the swerve, of what it means for death to be nothing. And when other members of the garden had questions or fears or doubts, both of them were there to listen. And then Metrodorus fell ill. The sources don't tell us exactly what was wrong. Ancient medicine wasn't precise about diagnoses, and the surviving accounts give us feelings more than facts, but whatever it was serious. It was slow, and it was terminal. Metrodorus was 53 years old, and as he weakened, it was Epicurus who took care of him. The man who taught that death was nothing to fear sat beside his closest friend's bed and watched him die. Whatever the philosophy says about atoms and void and the dissolution of the soul, whatever the arguments about prenatal non-existence and the symmetry of the void, Epicurus was there for all of it. The grief, the daily diminishment, the long, slow process of losing someone who had been part of his life for decades. Metrodorus died, and Epicurus adopted his children. That's not a philosophical position. That's not an argument about atoms or a cure for existential dread. That's love expressed in the most practical way available. I will raise your children because you can't. There's no record of Epicurus making a grand statement about it. No surviving letter where he explains the decision in philosophical terms. He just did it. Metrodorus's children needed a parent, and Epicurus became one. 7 years later, Epicurus himself was dying. The kidney stones, the strangury, the dysentery. That letter to Idomeneus that we started with on this blissful day, which is also the last of my life. But there was another letter too, or at least another passage that has survived. In his final hours, with his body failing in the ugly, undignified ways that bodies do, Epicurus asked his friends to watch over the children of Metrodorus. Not his own legacy, not his writings, not the continuation of his school. The children. His friend had been dead for 7 years, and Epicurus was still, in his final moments, being a parent to that friend's kids. The last thing he thought about wasn't the void or the swerve or whether the gods were indifferent. It was whether the children of someone he loved would be taken care of. There's a version of Epicureanism that lives only in textbooks, a tidy system of atoms and pleasures and 4 neat cures. And then there's this version, the version where a dying man's last words are about someone else's children, the version where friendship isn't just the most important philosophical ingredient, but the most important fact of a life. This is what the garden actually looked like in practice, not a school, a family, one that chose itself. And the garden didn't forget. After both Epicurus and Metrodorus were gone, their friends and followers established a ritual. On the 20th of every month, without exception, the community gathered to share a meal and remember. They remembered Epicurus. They remembered Metrodorus. They talked about what these men had taught them and what it meant to live without fear and with simple pleasures and in the company of people who mattered. This went on for centuries, not years, centuries. Long after anyone who had personally known Epicurus or Metrodorus had died, long after the original garden was gone and new communities had sprung up in its place across the Mediterranean, the monthly feast continued. New members of the garden, people who had never met the founders, sat down on the 20th and shared food and remembered. Philosophy became liturgy. Remembrance became medicine. The act of gathering, of eating together, of speaking the names of the dead, that was the philosophy in action. Not reading it, not thinking it, living it, the same way Epicurus had lived it, with bread on the table and friends in the room. There's something beautiful and a little bit heartbreaking about that image. A table set on the 20th of every month for people who are no longer alive to sit at it. A place held for the absent, a ritual that says, what we had together was real, and the fact that you're gone doesn't make it less real. If anything, the remembering makes it more so. Epicurus had written that the memory of past conversations could outweigh the worst physical pain. On his deathbed it did, and his followers took that seriously enough to build a practice around it. Every month, for hundreds of years, sit down, eat, remember, be less afraid. The garden was never designed to fight anyone. Its philosophy was therapeutic, not combative. Epicurus taught withdrawal, simplicity, friendship, the quiet cultivation of calm. It was, by design, the least aggressive school of thought in Athens. But the world outside the garden saw things differently. And what happened next was not what anyone in that quiet community would have expected or wanted. Epicurus founded his school in Athens in 306 BCE. Just 5 years later, in 301 BCE, a man named Zeno of Citium began teaching in the Stoa Poikal, that painted colonnade near the Athenian Agora. Zeno's students would become known as Stoics. And for the next several centuries, Stoicism and Epicureanism would be portrayed as bitter philosophical rivals, the great opposing camps of ancient thought, duty versus pleasure, engagement versus withdrawal, cosmos versus atoms. But here's the thing, that rivalry mostly happened after both founders were dead. Epicurus and Zeno were contemporaries in Athens for years. They likely knew of each other. They may even have encountered each other's students at the market or in the public spaces where ideas circulated, but there's no record of a personal feud. no surviving letter where Epicurus attacks Zeno or Zeno responds. The real hostilities came later, after the schools had hardened into institutions, after followers began defining themselves by opposition to the other side. Sibling philosophies born 5 years apart that grew into adversaries over generations, the way siblings sometimes do. And to be clear, the philosophical differences between them are real and significant. The Stoics believed in a providential universe, a cosmos governed by reason where everything happens for a purpose. The Epicureans believed in atoms and void and a universe that doesn't care about you. The Stoics valued engagement with public life, civic duty, the shouldering of responsibility. The Epicureans valued withdrawal, simplicity, the quiet garden over the noisy forum. These are genuinely different visions of how to live, but the hostility between the schools went beyond mere disagreement. It became personal. It became ugly. It was in this atmosphere of intensifying rivalry that one of the most effective character assassinations in the history of philosophy was carried out. Around 100 BCE, 2 centuries after Epicurus's death, a Stoic writer named Diotimus composed 50 letters and attributed them to Epicurus. 50, not a stray quote taken out of context or a single misattributed passage. 50 fabricated letters, deliberately designed to make Epicurus look like a debauched, licentious hedonist. The content of these letters was apparently so shocking, so vivid in its portrayal of excess and moral corruption, that the image they created stuck. For millennia, the idea that Epicurus was a glutton, a sensualist, a man devoted to physical pleasure above all else, an idea that flatly contradicts everything we know about his actual life, took root because of these forgeries. The scheme worked devastatingly irreversibly, because once a reputation exists, it's almost impossible to undo. Every subsequent writer who wanted to criticize Epicureanism had this caricature ready-made. They didn't need to engage with the actual philosophy, the bread and water, the atoms, the 4 cures, the friendship. They just pointed at the forged letters and said, "See, hedonist, degenerate, not worth taking seriously." Diotimus created a phantom Epicurus, a straw man so vivid that it replaced the real one in the public imagination. And that phantom is still with us every time someone uses the word Epicurean to mean someone who likes expensive food. The philosophical attacks came from other directions too. Plutarch, the Greek historian and essayist who would later be outraged that Leontian dared to write philosophy, devoted an entire essay to demolishing Epicureanism. The title alone is a weapon. That Epicurus actually makes a pleasant life impossible. His argument was that if you strip away belief in divine providence, if you deny that the gods care about you, if you insist that the soul dissolves at death with no afterlife, then you've removed everything that makes life bearable. All you have left is the flickering instability of bodily sensation. Pleasure without permanence, happiness without foundation, a pleasant life built on nothing. It's a sophisticated attack, and it has a certain force. If the gods don't watch over you, and death is total annihilation, and pleasure is nothing more than the absence of pain, then what exactly is the foundation of Epicurean happiness? What holds it up? Plutarch's answer, nothing. It's a philosophy of comfort that dissolves the moment you look at it too closely. Epicureans, of course, would have disagreed. They would have said that Plutarch was confusing the absence of metaphysical foundations with the absence of real foundations. The foundation of Epicurean happiness isn't divine providence or the promise of an afterlife. It's friendship. It's the simple satisfaction of natural needs. It's the knowledge that death is nothing and that your fears have no object. These are real things. They don't require gods to sustain them. But Plutarch had the bigger platform, the wider readership, and the advantage of writing for an audience that already assumed Epicureanism was shallow. His essay is one of history's most sustained philosophical attacks, and it shaped how Epicureanism was understood or misunderstood for centuries. Later writers would cite Plutarch the way a lawyer cites precedent. See, even the ancient critics knew this philosophy was hollow. Between Diotimus's forgeries and Plutarch's polemics, Epicurus was facing a war on two fronts, a fabricated reputation for debauchery from the Stoic camp, and a serious intellectual argument that his philosophy couldn't deliver what it promised from one of the most widely read authors in the ancient world. And both attacks happened after Epicurus was long dead, with no way to respond. The quiet philosopher who taught his students to live unknown was becoming, against his will and without his consent, one of the most publicly misrepresented thinkers in history. There's a painful irony in that, a philosophy designed to be lived quietly, in gardens, among friends, over bread and water, dragged into public view and made to look like something it never was. The forgeries dressed it in someone else's clothes. The polemics put it on trial in a court where it hadn't asked to appear. And Epicurus, who would have said the whole spectacle was a perfect example of vain and empty desire, the craving for reputation, for being right, for having the last word, was the one paying the price. But Plutarch's philosophical assault, sharp as it was nothing compared to what came next, because the institution that would eventually try to erase Epicureanism from Western thought wasn't another school of philosophy. It was the most powerful institution the Western world has ever known. There's a phrase that keeps showing up in discussions of Epicureanism, live unknown, laith biosas in Greek. It's treated as a core Epicurean principle, the idea that the wise person avoids public life, stays out of politics, keeps a low profile. And it makes sense within the framework. If empty desires include fame and power, then seeking the spotlight is a symptom of the disease, not a sign of health. But here's what's strange about that phrase. We don't actually have it from Epicurus, not directly. The saying, live unknown, comes to us through Plutarch, the same Plutarch who wrote an entire essay arguing that Epicurean philosophy makes happiness impossible. The same Plutarch who was outraged that Leontian, a woman, dared to write philosophy. We know the phrase only because Plutarch quoted it in his hostile Moralia, without providing any of the original context Epicurus might have given it. Think about what that means. One of the most famous Epicurean ideas is an idea we understand entirely through the filter of a man who hated Epicureanism. We have no way of knowing how Epicurus himself framed it, what qualifications he attached, what conversation it emerged from. It's like trying to understand a defendant's position by reading only the prosecution's closing argument. The words might be accurate, the meaning almost certainly isn't. This is the problem that runs through the entire history of Epicureanism. A philosophy that taught its followers to live quietly, to avoid the spotlight, to seek happiness in private gardens rather than public forums. That philosophy left very few defenders in the written record. Its enemies, on the other hand, wrote voluminously, and so what survived is disproportionately hostile. We see Epicurus through the eyes of people who hated what he stood for. And no group hated what he stood for more completely, or succeeded more thoroughly in burying it, than the early Christians. The Christian assault on Epicureanism began early and never really stopped. The charges were blunt. Self-indulgent hedonism and godlessness, that was the standard accusation. St. Augustine called Epicurus a pig, not metaphorically. He compared the philosopher to a literal pig wallowing in mud. Lactantius, another early church father, called the garden a den of iniquity. These are some of the most influential thinkers in the history of Western Christianity, and they treated Epicurus with a contempt usually reserved for enemies of the faith. And the irony is almost unbearable. Augustine called Epicurus a pig. Epicurus ate bread and water. Lactantius called the garden a den of iniquity. The garden's greatest luxury was a pot of cheese. The man who supposedly represented hedonistic excess lived a lifestyle more monastic than most actual monasteries would later practice. The monks who followed Benedict's rule, famous for their austerity, had more variety in their diet than Epicurus did. The accusation of hedonism was Diotimus's phantom, recycled by new attackers for new purposes. But it worked, because by the time Christianity was ascendant, Almost no one had access to Epicurus's actual writings to check. But the Christian opposition to Epicureanism wasn't really about hedonism. That was the public-facing charge, the one that played well in sermons and polemics. The real objection was deeper and more threatening. Epicureanism was materialist. It taught that everything is atoms and void. It taught that the soul is made of atoms and dissolves at death. It taught that there is no afterlife, no heaven, no hell, no continuation of consciousness, no divine judgment. It taught that the gods exist but are completely indifferent to human affairs. They don't punish, don't reward, don't answer prayers, don't intervene in history. Line those up side by side with Christian doctrine and the collision is total. Every single one of those claims strikes at the foundation of Christian theology. If there's no afterlife, then the promise of salvation, the central offer of Christianity, means nothing. If the soul dissolves at death, then the resurrection is impossible. If the gods don't care about you, then prayer is pointless, and the entire apparatus of the church, its priests, its rituals, its authority, rests on nothing. Epicureanism wasn't just a different philosophy. It wasn't a rival school you could debate and coexist with, the way Stoicism and Platonism were eventually absorbed into Christian thought. It was, from the Christian perspective, a direct negation of everything that made the faith work. A systematic dismantling of every metaphysical assumption Christianity depends on. So the suppression that followed wasn't casual or accidental. It was thorough and deliberate. Epicurean books were not copied by the monasteries that preserved most other ancient texts. Why would they preserve heresy? Epicurean schools were pressured, defunded, and eventually they closed. The texts that survived did so almost by accident, a copy here, a fragment there, preserved in libraries that happened not to be purged. The philosophy of the garden, which had been one of the major intellectual traditions of the ancient world for 600 years, longer than Christianity itself would be, by the time the suppression was complete, was slowly, systematically pushed to the margins of Western thought and then beyond them. And when it was gone or seemed to be gone, the caricature was all that remained. Epicurus the pig, the den of iniquity, the philosophy of pleasure that couldn't possibly work. Centuries of suppression had done their job. The real Epicurus was buried. The phantom was all anyone remembered. But ideas, it turns out, are surprisingly hard to kill. You can burn books, you can close schools, you can slander the author and outlaw the teachings. But if even one copy survives, one manuscript in a forgotten monastery, one scroll sealed in volcanic ash, one wall carved in stone by a dying man, the ideas can come back. And in the case of Epicureanism, they did come back. Through a chain of survival so improbable it almost feels designed, though Epicurus himself would have insisted it was nothing more than atoms swerving in the right direction at the right time. Epicurus wrote over 300 works. 300. We're talking about one of the most prolific philosophical authors of the ancient world, a man who covered everything from atomic theory to ethics to the nature of the gods to how to live and how to die. 300 scrolls, give or take, produced over a lifetime of thinking and teaching and writing in the garden. Almost all of it is gone. What survives is so little it can be listed in a single breath. 3 letters to Menocius, to Pythocles, and to Herodotus. 2 collections of maxims, the principal doctrines which were known throughout the ancient world, and the Vatican sayings which weren't discovered until 1888 when a scholar found them in a manuscript in the Vatican library. That's it. From 300 works, 3 letters, and 2 lists of sayings. Everything else, the detailed arguments, the full-length treatises, the responses to critics, the nuances and qualifications and extensions that would have let us understand his thinking in depth, all of it was lost. Not by accident, by neglect that was in many cases deliberate. The monks who preserved Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics did not preserve Epicurus. There was no reason to. He was the pig, the den of iniquity, not worth the parchment. Imagine if we only knew Plato through 3 of his shorter dialogues and a handful of isolated quotes, with everything else, the Republic, the Symposium, the Laws, gone forever. That's the situation we're in with Epicurus. The philosophy we've been discussing for hours now, the atoms, the swerve, the four cures, the nature of the gods, the arguments against death, all of that has been reconstructed from fragments, from hostile secondary sources, and from one remarkable piece of luck. So how do we know what we know? How is it possible to reconstruct a philosophical system in this kind of detail when almost everything the founder wrote has been destroyed? The answer is one man, a Roman poet named Titus Lucretius Carus, who lived about 2 centuries after Epicurus, and who did something extraordinary. He wrote the entire Epicurean system down in a poem, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, 7,400 lines of Latin verse composed in dactylic hexameter, the same meter Homer used for the Iliad and the Odyssey. It covers everything. Atoms, void, the swerve, the mortality of the soul, the indifference of the gods, the origins of human civilization, the nature of plague and weather and love and death. It is the only surviving full-length exposition of Epicurean philosophy. Without it, we would know Epicurus's system only in fragments and through the hostile summaries of people who wanted to discredit him. There's something astonishing about the fact that a philosophy survived not in a treatise but in a poem. Lucretius didn't write a textbook, he wrote something beautiful. He used imagery and rhythm and emotional power to convey ideas that could have been stated dryly. The opening invocation to Venus, the goddess of pleasure and creation, is one of the most celebrated passages in all of Latin literature. The description of the plague of Athens that closes the poem is harrowing and vivid. He made philosophy feel urgent, felt alive. And because he did that, because he wrapped Epicurean ideas in language that people wanted to read and copy and preserve, the ideas survived when their original formulations didn't. But even De Rerum Natura almost didn't make it. During the Middle Ages, the poem was essentially forgotten. Like Epicurus's own writings, it wasn't the kind of text that monastic copyists would prioritize. It was materialist, it denied the afterlife, it argued that the gods were irrelevant. A few scattered references indicate that some copies existed in various European libraries, but it was not widely read, not widely discussed, not widely copied. It was slipping away. And then in 1417, a man named Poggio Bracciolini walked into a German monastery and changed the course of intellectual history. Poggio was a papal secretary, an Italian humanist who spent his spare time hunting for lost classical manuscripts in the monastery libraries of Northern Europe. He knew that the monks had preserved vast quantities of ancient Latin texts, many of them unread for centuries, moldering in damp scriptoria. He was looking for anything interesting. And in that German monastery, the exact one is debated, but it was probably Fulda, he found a complete copy of De Rerum Natura. The significance of this discovery is hard to overstate. Stephen Greenblatt, in his book The Swerve, argues that Poggio's finding helped ignite the Renaissance. That's a bold claim, and historians debate it. But what's beyond debate is that the reintroduction of Lucretius's poem into European intellectual life gave thinkers access to a complete, coherent materialist philosophy for the first time in nearly 1,000 years. It influenced Machiavelli, Galileo, Newton, and eventually the entire Enlightenment. The atoms that Epicurus had described, the void that Lucretius had written about in dactylic hexameter, those ideas, carried by a single poem found in a single monastery by a single man, became part of the foundation of modern science. One poem, that's how thin the thread was. If Poggio hadn't gone to that monastery, or if the monks had discarded that particular manuscript, or if the binding had fallen apart in the damp, or if any of 100 small accidents had gone differently, we might never have recovered Epicurean philosophy in anything close to its full form. The ideas that a man ate bread and water to develop, that a slave named Mouse discussed as an equal, that a dying philosopher weighed against his agony and found sufficient, those ideas hung, for centuries, on a single piece of parchment in a cold stone room. But Poggio's manuscript wasn't the only rescue. because while his poem was surviving by a thread in European monasteries, another collection of Epicurean writings was hidden in a place no one could access, sealed beneath 20 meters of volcanic rock in a ruined city on the Bay of Naples. In 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the Roman city of Herculaneum under approximately 20 meters of volcanic rock. Everyone knows about Pompeii, the neighboring city that was buried in ash. Herculaneum gets less attention, partly because it was smaller, partly because the volcanic material that covered it, a fast-moving surge of superheated gas and rock called a pyroclastic flow, packed it under a much denser, harder layer than Pompeii's ashfall. Herculaneum was sealed completely, like a city locked inside a mountain. And inside that sealed city was a building that has turned out to be one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. The Villa of the Papyri, named for what was found inside it, contained a private library of over 1,800 papyrus scrolls. 1,800. That makes it the only complete surviving library from all of classical antiquity. Every other ancient library, the Library of Alexandria, the libraries of Pergamum and Rome and Athens, was burned, looted, scattered, or simply decayed. This one survived because a volcano buried it so fast and so deep that nothing could reach it. Survived is a complicated word here because it doesn't mean what you might think. The scrolls weren't preserved the way you'd preserve a book by putting it in a dry room and closing the door. They were carbonized. The heat of the volcanic material turned them black, brittle, fragile. They looked like charred logs more than scrolls. For centuries after their excavation began in the 1750s, scholars attempted to unroll them, often destroying them in the process. The papyrus crumbled at the touch. Reading them seemed impossible. The scrolls existed, you could hold them, you could photograph them, you could see that they had once been documents filled with writing, but their contents were locked inside, tantalizingly close and completely inaccessible. The greatest irony, a volcano had both preserved them and made them unreadable, simultaneously saving and concealing the words. And here's what makes this story specifically relevant to everything we've been talking about. The Villa of the Papyri wasn't a general-purpose library. It was an Epicurean library. At least 44 of the works found inside were written by Philodemus of Gadara, a 1st century BCE Epicurean philosopher who was, it turns out, a friend and philosophical companion of some of the most powerful people in Rome. The villa likely belonged to a man named Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus. That name might not mean much on its own, but Piso Caesoninus was Julius Caesar's father-in-law. Epicurean philosophy, the philosophy of bread and water and living unknown, was being studied and practiced in the household of the most powerful family in Rome. The man who would become dictator, who would reshape the entire Roman Republic, who would be assassinated on the Senate floor, that man's family library was stocked with Epicurean philosophy. The connection between the garden's quiet withdrawal and Roman imperial power is stranger and more intimate than most history books acknowledge. Epicurus said, "Live unknown." His intellectual legacy lived in the house of the most famous man in the ancient world. Philodemus himself was a serious and prolific thinker. He wrote on aesthetics, on music, on rhetoric, on anger, on death, on the nature of the gods. His works represent a living Epicurean tradition, not fossilized doctrine but active philosophical inquiry continuing centuries after Epicurus's death. And those works were sitting in Herculaneum, carbonized but intact, waiting for someone to figure out how to read them. For a long time no one could, for centuries no one could. The technology simply didn't exist. Various attempts over the centuries, chemical treatments, careful mechanical unrolling, infrared photography, multispectral imaging produced partial results. Some texts were recovered in fragments, enough to know that the library was primarily Epicurean, enough to recognize Philodemus's hand. But vast quantities remained stubbornly unreadable, their contents locked inside carbon that crumbled at the slightest pressure, guardians of secrets they couldn't release. And then in 2023, something happened that would have seemed like science fiction a decade earlier. A team of researchers using artificial intelligence and advanced X-ray imaging managed to decode more than 2,000 characters from a previously unreadable Herculaneum scroll, without touching it, without unrolling it. The AI had been trained to detect the extremely subtle differences in texture between the ink and the carbonized papyrus, differences invisible to the human eye, and use those differences to reconstruct the text character by character. The scroll they read turned out to be a philosophical discussion about the nature of pleasure. Based on the style and content, it's most likely a previously unknown work by Philodmus, which means, after nearly 2,000 years buried under volcanic ash, after Epicurus's own writings were destroyed, after the Christian suppression, after Diotimus's forgeries and Plutarch's polemics, new Epicurean philosophy is still being discovered. In our lifetime, right now. Sit with that for a moment. There's something almost absurd about it. A philosophy that the world tried to erase, that had its founder called a pig, its texts deliberately not copied, its schools shut down, is being pulled, word by word, from the inside of a carbonized scroll by an artificial intelligence in the 21st century. The conversation continues. New voices from Epicurus's tradition, unheard for 2 millennia, are beginning to speak again. Epicurus, who believed everything is atoms and void, who built his entire philosophy on the claim that matter is all there is, he would probably find a grim humor in the fact that it's atoms, specifically the atomic-level differences between ink particles and papyrus fibers, that are finally bringing his tradition back from the edge of extinction. Poggio found a manuscript in a monastery. Technology decoded carbon in a scroll. But one man, centuries before either of those rescues, decided that neither parchment nor papyrus was permanent enough. He chose something harder, something that could outlast fire and water and neglect and the deliberate destruction that had erased so much already. He chose stone. In the 2nd century CE, roughly 400 years after Epicurus died, in a period when the Roman Empire was at its height and Greek philosophy was still very much a living tradition, a man named Diogenes lived in the remote Lycian city of Ononda. That's in the mountains of southwestern Turkey, far from Athens, far from Rome, far from the centers of intellectual power, a small city on the edge of the known world. Diogenes was old, he was ill, he knew he didn't have much time left, and he decided to do something that remains, to this day, one of the most extraordinary acts of philosophical devotion in recorded history. He carved Epicurean philosophy into a wall. Not a few sentences, not a plaque or a memorial stone with a pithy quote. An enormous inscription, approximately 25,000 words, carved into the stone portico of a public building in Ononda. 260 square meters of philosophical text, chiseled letter by letter into rock. It is the longest known inscription from all of Greek and Roman antiquity. Nothing else comes close. 25,000 words, that's roughly the length of a short novel. And Diogenes had every word of it carved into stone by hand, in a city most people in the Roman Empire had never heard of, for an audience of strangers who might never read it. The labor involved is staggering, months, probably years, of work by skilled stonemasons, at considerable expense, directed by a dying man who had no guarantee that anyone would ever stop to read what he'd commissioned. So why did he do it? He told us because Diogenes included his motivation in the inscription itself. Being in the old age of my life and expecting to depart at any moment, he wrote, I wish to help also those who come after us, and to place therefore the remedies of salvation by means of this porch. The remedies of salvation. He used a medical metaphor, just like Epicurus, just like the Tetrapharmakos, and the porch, the physical stone structure, was the delivery mechanism. Diogenes was writing a prescription and building the pharmacy at the same time, a dying man carving medicine into stone for patients he would never meet. Strangers who might walk through this portico decades or centuries later and find, cut into the walls around them, the four-part cure for what was keeping them up at night. There's something almost overwhelmingly generous about that gesture. Diogenes gained nothing from it. He was dying. He would never know if anyone read the wall. He would never know if it helped. But he had found something in Epicurean philosophy that had eased his own suffering, and he wanted to pass it on, not to his friends they presumably already knew, not to his community. A wall this large was aimed at a much broader audience. He wanted to reach forward in time, across the gap that death would create between him and everyone who came after, and offer what he'd found. That's friendship in the Epicurean sense, not limited to people you know, extended to everyone, friendship going dancing round the world. The wall at Ononda survived in fragments. Archaeologists have been recovering pieces since the 19th century, and new fragments are still being found. The inscription has been partially reconstructed, and what we can read confirms that it covered the major themes of Epicurean philosophy: the nature of the gods, the fear of death, the classification of desires, the pursuit of ataraxia. Diogenes wasn't an original philosopher. He was a transmitter. A man who believed the cure worked and wanted to make sure it outlasted him. And the fact that we can still read parts of his wall 2,000 years later, in a city most people have never heard of in the mountains of Turkey, is itself a kind of proof that his gamble paid off. Stone lasts, paper burns, scrolls carbonize, but stone endures. Diogenes was not the last person to feel this way about Epicurean philosophy. 17 centuries later, on a different continent, in a nation that didn't exist when Diogenes was alive, another man read Epicurus and felt compelled to say so. In 1819, Thomas Jefferson, former President of the United States, author of the Declaration of Independence, one of the most celebrated minds in American history, wrote a letter to his friend William Short. And in that letter, he made a philosophical confession that might surprise you if you think of Jefferson primarily as a political thinker. "I too am an Epicurean," he wrote. That's not a casual remark. Jefferson had thought deeply about ancient philosophy. He'd read Plato and dismissed him, called his philosophy whimsies, and described his writing as the product of a foggy mind. He'd studied the Stoics and found them admirable but too austere. He'd evaluated Aristotle and found him systematic but cold. And after all of that reading, all of that comparison, he landed on Epicurus, the philosopher of the garden. The man who ate bread and water and said friendship was the highest wisdom. Jefferson called the genuine, not the imputed, doctrines of Epicurus, the thing that contains everything rational in moral philosophy which Greece and Rome have left us. Everything rational, that's a strong endorsement from a man who helped design a country. He was drawing a line between the real Epicurus, the one who lived simply and taught the four cures, and the phantom Epicurus that Diotimus had fabricated and the church had amplified. Jefferson saw through the smear. He read the actual texts, and he recognized in them something that, for all the centuries of distortion, still rang true. The author of The Pursuit of Happiness admired the philosopher who said happiness is the absence of pain. The connections between Epicurean philosophy and the founding documents of the United States are debated by scholars. Some see a direct line, others a resonance that stops short of causation. But what's beyond debate is that Jefferson knew Epicurus, preferred him to every other ancient philosopher, and said so explicitly. From a dying man in the mountains of Turkey, carving philosophy into stone, to a founding father in Virginia, writing a letter to a friend, the thread of Epicurean thought runs across centuries, across continents, across every effort to break it. And the school that carried that thread was not some marginal sect that flickered in and out of existence. It lasted longer than almost anyone realizes. The Epicurean school lasted longer than any other Greek philosophical school, roughly 600 years from its founding in 306 BCE until it faded in the 4th century CE under the combined pressure of Christian dominance and institutional hostility. 600 years. To put that in perspective, that's longer than the gap between Shakespeare and the present day. If Shakespeare had founded a philosophical school in Elizabethan England, and it were still operating right now, in our century, with active members, monthly feasts, and a continuous intellectual tradition, that's the kind of duration we're talking about. And for most of that span, the Epicurean school wasn't a marginal curiosity. It was one of the major philosophical traditions of the ancient world, with communities across the Mediterranean, in Athens, in Rome, in Alexandria, in the small cities of Turkey and North Africa and the Greek islands. Think about the continuity that represents. People gathered on the 20th of every month for 6 centuries. They ate together. They remembered Epicurus and Metrodorus. They discussed the 4 cures and genuinely tried to live by them. That's an extraordinary record of institutional persistence for a philosophy that taught its followers to live unknown. And the ideas didn't stop when the school did. They went underground, survived in fragments and in one poem and in carbonized scrolls and on a carved stone wall, and then they resurfaced in the Renaissance, in the Enlightenment, and in a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1819. We talked about Jefferson's confession, "I too am an Epicurean," but there's a further connection that deserves attention, even if scholars debate its exact nature. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and one of the most famous phrases in that document, "The pursuit of happiness," resonates with Epicurean philosophy in a way that's hard to dismiss as coincidence. The Stoics wouldn't have talked about the pursuit of happiness. They would have talked about the pursuit of virtue or duty or rational self-governance. Plato would have pointed toward the pursuit of truth or the form of the good, but Jefferson chose happiness, not virtue, not truth, not duty, happiness, and he put it alongside life and liberty as an unalienable right, something you don't need to earn and no one can take from you. That's very Epicurean. Maybe not perfectly Epicurean. Epicurus might have said that happiness isn't something you pursue so much as something you arrive at by letting go of what prevents it. But the basic architecture of the idea that happiness isn't a reward for good behavior but a natural state that belongs to you, that you have an unalienable right to seek, that's close to what Epicurus was saying about ataraxia. The good life isn't something you earn through sacrifice or achieve through competitive excellence. It's something available to everyone, always, as long as you understand what it actually consists of and stop chasing things that don't contribute to it. Whether Jefferson was consciously channeling Epicurus when he wrote The Pursuit of Happiness, or whether the idea arrived through layers of intellectual influence too complex to trace, is something historians will probably never settle definitively. What's certain is that Jefferson preferred Epicurus to every other ancient philosopher. He called Plato's philosophy whimsies and foggy mind. He explicitly rejected the Stoics' emphasis on apathy and endurance. And he said in writing that the genuine doctrines of Epicurus contain everything rational in ancient moral philosophy. The man who helped design the world's most powerful democracy found his deepest philosophical home in a garden where a slave named Mouse studied beside free citizens, and a pot of cheese was a luxury. There's something moving about that, and something instructive, because it suggests that Epicurean ideas, the ones that survived forgery and suppression and volcanic burial, aren't just historically interesting. They're the kind of ideas that keep speaking to people across enormous distances of time and circumstance. And Epicurus wanted them to. He was explicit about this. In his letter to Menocius, one of those 3 surviving letters, the one that contains most of his ethical teachings, he wrote, "Let no one be slow to seek wisdom when he is young, nor weary in the search of it when he has grown old, for no age is too early or too late for the health of the soul." The health of the soul, that medical metaphor again. The Tetrapharmakos isn't age-restricted. There's no minimum dosage. You don't need to have reached a certain level of education or a certain stage of life or a certain degree of suffering before the cure becomes relevant. If you're young and anxious about the future, anxious about what you're supposed to do with your life, about whether you're making the right choices, about the vast uncertainty stretching out ahead of you, the 4 cures have something for you. If you're old and anxious about the end, about what comes after, about whether the time you've had was enough, about the darkness that seems to be approaching, they have something for you too. Philosophy as medicine has no waiting room. There's no prerequisite. You don't need a referral. You just need to start. And that invitation, that open door, the same open door that welcomed Maus and Leontian and Metrodorus and strangers from across the Mediterranean, is still open. Not in a garden in Athens, not on a wall in Turkey, not in a carbonized scroll in Naples, but in the ideas themselves, which have proven over 2,300 years to be remarkably, stubbornly difficult to kill. But Epicurus was honest about something. He was a physician of the soul, but he wasn't a con artist. He didn't promise a complete cure with no side effects. And late in his collected sayings, in a line that only came to light when the Vatican sayings were discovered in 1888, he acknowledged something about the fear of death that even his own philosophy couldn't fully resolve. The Vatican sayings, that collection of Epicurean maxims discovered in a Vatican library manuscript in 1888, over 2,000 years after they were first written down, contain a line that feels different from almost everything else in the Epicurean corpus. It's quieter, more vulnerable, less certain. Against all else it is possible to procure security, it reads, but when it comes to death, we human beings all live in an unwalled city. An unwalled city, think about that image. In the ancient world, walls were security. A walled city could withstand siege, could protect its citizens from invasion, could create a space where life could proceed with some measure of safety. An unwalled city was exposed, open, vulnerable to whatever came from the outside. And Epicurus, or whoever in the Epicurean tradition authored this particular saying, is admitting something that most philosophical systems would never admit. When it comes to death, we are all exposed, all of us, all vulnerable, no exceptions. No matter how many arguments we internalize, no matter how deeply we absorb the logic that death is nothing to us, no matter how thoroughly we convince ourselves that the symmetry between prenatal non-existence and posthumous non-existence means there's nothing to fear. When it comes to the actual, visceral, bone-deep human fear of ceasing to exist, we live without walls. That's an astonishing admission from a tradition that spent centuries building the most sophisticated philosophical case against death anxiety ever constructed. Epicurus didn't sell the cure as infallible. He didn't promise that if you follow the 4 remedies, you'll never feel afraid again. He said, here are the best tools I've found. They work. They really do work. I used them myself on my own deathbed, and I called it a blissful day. But the fear doesn't go away entirely. It's a permanent neighbor. It lives next door. You learn to coexist with it, not to eliminate it. The cure is real. The fear is also real, both things at once, and somehow that's okay. And maybe this is my own reading, not orthodox Epicureanism. Maybe that's actually more comforting than a promise of total fearlessness would be. Because if someone tells you that the correct application of philosophy will make you completely unafraid of death, and then you apply the philosophy and still feel afraid sometimes, you're left with 2 problems. The original fear plus the feeling that you failed. You're doing philosophy wrong. The cure didn't work on you. But if Epicurus himself says, look, we all live in an unwalled city, if the man who built the cure admits the fear is permanent, then your fear isn't failure. It's human. It's shared. It's exactly what Epicurus predicted. And in that shared vulnerability, there's a kind of companionship, a solidarity, a room full of people who are all afraid and who have decided to face it together rather than alone. That feels very much like what the garden was about. That feels, in fact, like friendship. We started this conversation with a dying man. Epicurus, 71 years old, his body destroyed by kidney stones and dysentery, dictating a letter to his friend Idomeneus. On this blissful day, which is also the last of my life. He didn't say the day was painless. He didn't say he wasn't afraid. He said the memory of past conversations outweighed the suffering. He set friendship on one side of the scale and agony on the other, and friendship, it turned out, was heavier. That's not theory, that's what happened. On the worst day of his life, the memory of people he loved was enough. The last detail comes to us, ironically, from Cicero, a man who was hostile to Epicureanism, who criticized the philosophy in multiple works, who thought it was ultimately inadequate. But Cicero couldn't help preserving something that his hostility tried to obscure, the fact that Epicurus was so beloved by his followers that entire cities honored him, and his friends were so devoted that their loyalty was compared to a religious bond. The man who said, "Live unknown," was remembered with near religious fervor for centuries after his death. Sit with that for a moment, because there's something deeply telling about it. An enemy preserved what a friend would have treasured. History is strange that way. There's a paradox in that detail, and it's the same paradox that runs through this entire story. A philosophy of quietness that became thunderingly influential. A man who ate bread and water called a hedonist. A school that taught withdrawal from public life, whose ideas shaped the founding of a nation. A tradition that was supposed to vanish, that refused to stay silent. Epicurus would probably not have been surprised by any of this. He knew the fear of death was permanent. He knew the cure was imperfect. He knew that the only real comfort was the company of people who faced the same fears honestly. And he knew that friendships formed around honest facing, around shared meals and shared vulnerability, and the shared admission that we live in an unwalled city. Those friendships are the strongest medicine there is. Not stronger than death, he was honest about that. Nothing is stronger than death, but strong enough to change how it feels while you're alive, strong enough to turn the last day of a life into a blissful one. Strong enough that 2,300 years later, a man on his deathbed in Turkey carved the remedy into stone for strangers, and a president in Virginia wrote to a friend and said, "I too am an Epicurean." And somewhere tonight, someone lying awake with the same old fear, the one that lives next door, the one no wall can keep out, is hearing these words and feeling, maybe, the first faint loosening. Anises, an unclenching, the beginning of the cure. We came at Epicurus expecting a hedonist and found a doctor, a man who ate bread and water and called his worst day blissful. What he left behind wasn't a system for thinking about the world, it was a prescription for living in it with a little less fear. 4 remedies, a garden, a table set for friends, and the quiet suggestion offered without pressure from across 23 centuries that the cure begins whenever you're ready, that it was always available, that it still is.